Is Christianity the air we breathe? Has Christianity so profoundly affected the moral culture of our times that it's proper to call contemporary moral values fundamentally Christian? That's the discussion I had with Christian apologist Glen Scrivener recently. Glen works with Speak Life Ministries just down the road from the University of Sussex, where I'm the lead chaplain. And so it made sense to bring him in to have a conversation about this important topic. And let me tell you, we had a fantastic debate. There were tons of students there. It was a great vibe. We had a respectful and honest conversation. And so I want to start this video by thanking Glen and his team for making it such a good event and for making such a brilliant video of the debate, which you can find on the Speak Life YouTube channel. If you haven't watched it yet, I recommend you pop over and watch the debate, because this is my response to Glen's response. Yes, Glen made a response video to the debate, and in it he made a lot of points about the arguments I'd presented, and the purpose of this video is to respond to them. Now, Glen also at the end of his video asked me 3 big questions about my views. I'm not going to answer those questions in this video. It's just too much to do in one single video. And I'm all on my own here, just learning how to do this. So I'm doing my best. I'm going to respond to everything he said about the debate itself, but you'll have to wait for a second video for me to answer Glen's 3 questions. But I promise, if you're coming from his response video, I will answer his questions. It'll just be in a second video. Now, in case you need a refresher on our discussion, Glen's argument was that contemporary values are owed to Christianity. The West depends on Christianity, he said, and Christianity is the foundation of dignity and human rights in Glen's mind. I made a slightly different argument. I argued that the values we hold today are the result of multiple philosophical and religious influences, and therefore it would be wrong to claim contemporary values for Christianity exclusively, because there are pre-Christian, anti-Christian, and non-Christian sources of our contemporary moral culture. Right at the outset, I want to note an important area of agreement, because at the beginning of the debate, Glen accepts that there have indeed been other non-Christian influences on Western morality. Listen to what Glen says.
Not to deny that there have been other tributaries into Western civilization, but Christianity has the greatest say among those tributaries. It also has tended to shape the way that we view those other influences.
Christianity, he said, has the greatest say, but not the only say, he seems to suggest. There are other tributaries running into the great moral stream that makes up today's moral culture. I think it's important to stress this, because sometimes Glen and others who make this argument speak as if non-Christian philosophies had zero influence on contemporary moral culture. But here, at least at the beginning of the debate, Glen seemed to be more open to the possibility of non-Christian ideas influencing how we think today. So if we take a zoom out and we think about the big picture of our disagreement, we're basically disagreeing about how much influence non-Christian traditions have had on how we think about morality today, and whether it is enough to make untenable the argument that Christianity in particular is responsible for our contemporary approach to values.
And by the way, what percentage of our moral sensibilities have been shaped by Hippocrates or Sophocles in the more egalitarian moments, or by Buddhists or Confucianists? Like, what proportion?
Determining how much a particular religious tradition or philosophy has influenced how the West thinks about things is very difficult. It's very difficult to answer that question with precision. In fact, even Glen seems to find it difficult to stick to one line on this. Remember, he said at the start of the debate that there have indeed been other tributaries into Western civilization? Well, here's what he says in his later response video.
Pre-Christian and non-Christian influences on the West are a vanishingly small proportion of what has actually shaped our moral sensibilities.
Now, those two statements have very different emphases, at least. In one, Christianity is the predominant voice among many. In another, it is the only voice that has visible influence. And that strikes me as two different points of view. So why the contradiction? Well, one problem, I think, is that the metaphor we are using in this conversation is misleading. The metaphor that there is a moral air that we breathe suggests that we should be able to relatively easily identify which quantities of different religions and philosophies are present in our cultural environment. After all, we can relatively easily break air down into its constituent components. So if the metaphor holds all the way through, we should be able to do that with the influence of different philosophies and ideas. But I don't think we can do that. I think that metaphor misleads us, because I think the development of culture is more like a conversation than like a physical environment like air. Imagine a conversation that you are having with a few friends one night. You've had a few drinks, it's a big philosophical discussion, it goes on for hours. And then the next day, after your hangovers have worn off, you're trying to figure out how much of the conclusion of that conversation is down to which participant. Could you do that? Could you say 20% of it was Bob's influence, but Tina was in there with 7%, and Jimothy had an amazing 48% influence on our conversation? I don't think you could do that. I think it would be unreasonably specific to attempt to break down the contributions of different people in a conversation to a certain percentage. Now, imagine a conversation that has gone on for millennia, involving millions of different people and thousands of different religions and philosophical and political traditions. When we appreciate how complex the cultural development of ideas is, I think we begin to see how a question like Glen's, what percent of our cultural beliefs and morality is attributable to Christianity versus other belief systems, is too blunt. It's a simplistic question. And that's why in my argument, instead of trying to say humanism has had 40% influence on our values, I instead point to what I think are illustrative examples of non-Christian sources of our common values to try and make the point that there are specific individuals and groups where we can trace the influence to today, if we're careful about it, without saying how much as a percentage influence they have had. Now, Glen is not, of course, convinced by my argument, so let's see what I can do to respond to his concerns. My first argument in the debate was that there are actually pre-Christian sources that influence today's moral values. And I pointed particularly to Hippocrates and the corpus of medical writing and the Hippocratic corpus that Hippocrates inspired and may have been a part of. I made the point in the debate that we don't know a whole lot about Hippocrates himself. I was more talking about the corpus of writing that existed in ancient Greece prior to the advent of Christianity that had a sort of more universalistic ethic. Now, when it comes to those pre-Christian sources of a more humanistic ethic, Glen says that we look back and appreciate the morals of the people who wrote things like the Hippocratic corpus because Christians taught us to like that sort of thing. Listen to what he says.
The reason why we reach for Hippocrates and not Plato on this issue is because of Christianity. The reason why we like the Hippocratic Oath and we don't like Spartans throwing the malformed and girls down wells, the reason why we might like a Buddhist kind of understanding of compassion rather than the martial glory of Rome necessarily, is because of Christianization. I think that's utterly obvious.
I could make exactly the same argument. I can say we reach back and appreciate the morals of Hippocrates and the medical writers in ancient Greece because of a moral culture that we've inherited that was born of many different influences. And that has taught us to like that sort of thing. Or I could turn the argument around on Glen, and I could say that Glen sees in the Bible a prefiguration of contemporary moral ethics because he is interpreting the Bible through the lens provided by millennia of moral innovation, much of it by non-Christian thinkers. We can both argue that our appreciation of moral elements of ancient texts is due to the influence of cultural factors, but that doesn't settle any disagreement between us about what has influenced those cultural factors. So I think that is a non-point in the sense that it doesn't actually advance Glen's argument at all. Now, there's a second worry that Glen raises, which is a bigger problem for my case if it's true. He argues that pre-Christian morals, like those of the Greek medical authors, just didn't actually have much influence on us after all. They may have been things that people believed in isolated parts of ancient Greece, but those ideas never influenced anybody. They were never passed down like a sort of evolutionary dead end. It's not related to us in any way. Now, I think Glen is wrong about this. I think that for two reasons. Firstly, I see an internal contradiction in his argument. Glen clearly believes that my morals and the morals of people living in the West today are influenced by the Christian culture in which we live and grew up. So much so that he's willing to say I'm not really a humanist and that my morals are fundamentally Christian, discounting the influence of my non-religious parents, my study of humanist philosophy, my experience working with many non-Christians, representatives of non-Christian religions. And he claims that my ethics are fundamentally Christian despite all that, simply because of the influence of the prevailing culture in which I grew up. But why doesn't the same apply to early Christians? They, after all, developed their ideas within a moral culture. They were in discourse with other thinkers in their time. They clearly knew about and responded to the arguments of contemporary thinkers. So why should we discount the influence of their contemporaries and important precursors of the Christian faith, while insisting that today's atheists like me are inherently Christian because of the culture in which I grew up? If my moral beliefs are fundamentally Christian because I grew up in a Christian culture, then why aren't Jesus's beliefs or Jesus's followers' beliefs fundamentally Jewish or fundamentally Greek because of the culture in which they grew up? I think to be consistent, Glen has to choose one of two paths, and neither of them gets him where he wants to go. He has to accept that Jesus and his contemporaries were themselves steeped in a different moral climate and give credit to that moral climate for influencing them. Or he can accept that individuals can reason about their beliefs and come to different ideas that are not representative of the moral climate of the time, in which case that can be true of an atheist like me today and some of the other thinkers I'm going to describe. But either way, he doesn't get where he wants, which is to credit Christianity with today's moral beliefs, but not the precursors of Christianity with Christian beliefs. That's inconsistent. I think we can go further, though. I think we can actually point to numerous areas where pre-Christian moral ideas influenced early Christianity. Paul's letters are in parts indebted to ancient pagan philosophy, for instance, using Stoic moral concepts and terminology to express moral ideas. The belief that we all have a conscience, an inbuilt guide to moral action, is found in Paul's epistles, yes, and in the writings of earlier Stoics, and it was a very widespread idea in the cultural ether at the time when Christ was alive. Christian scholars have themselves noted the influence of earlier Greek thought on developing Christian theology, like Professor George Holly Gilbert, a theologian, a minister, a professor of the New Testament at Chicago Theological Seminary. He argued back in 1909 that there was profound influence of Greek ideas on developing Christian ideas. Of course, the most obvious way that Christian morality was shaped by pre-Christian sources is through the influence of Judaism. Jesus was Jewish. He used distinctively Jewish styles in his moral teaching through stories and parables. He constantly referred to Jewish scripture. The influence of Judaism on Christianity is hard to overstate. But it's striking how few of today's Christian apologists want to credit Judaism for shaping Christian morality. They claim many ideas that actually originated in Judaism, like the idea that human beings are made in the image of God. They claim that for Christianity when it's part of the Jewish scriptures. And all this, I think, is an attempt to underplay the influence of pre-Christian philosophies and religions on Christian thought in order to claim contemporary moral culture for Christianity. Indeed, even Tom Holland, the historian who's done more than anyone to popularize the idea that our contemporary moral discourse is fundamentally Christian, says himself that Christianity is a fusion, that's his words, of Jewish and Greek thought. And something that is a fusion of two other things is deeply indebted to those things. So people on Glen's side of the argument agree with me that pre-Christian moral thinking was very influential on Christianity. I'm in good scholarly company here. Now, I suppose a defender of Glen's view might have one final argument to make, which is that while Greek thought was influential on Christian metaphysics, they might say it wasn't influential on Christian moral thinking. The problem with that argument for someone like Glen is that it is wholly inconsistent with one of the main pillars of their case, which is that Christian metaphysics underpins Christian morality. And if it's true that Christian metaphysics is essential to Christian morality, and Glen says multiple times in our debate that it is true, and if it's true that Greek thought deeply influenced Christian metaphysics, which I think the scholarly record shows, then it is true that Christian moral thought is heavily indebted to earlier Greek philosophical ideas. Now, let's say you reject all that. Let's say that there is no meaningful influence on the moral ideas of Christianity coming from pre-Christian thinkers like Jewish thinkers, Greek thinkers. Even if you think that's the case, you have to accept that during the Renaissance, pre-Christian thought was profoundly influential on what has become today's moral culture. If pre-Christian sources didn't influence early Christianity in your mind, then you have to accept they influenced later Christianity when those sources were rediscovered and disseminated during the Renaissance. And often this influence moved people away from, not toward, whatever the church's positions were at the time. Think of Pico della Mirandola, who wrote one of the defining texts of Renaissance humanism, The Oration on the Dignity of Man. It's a very weird little text. I recommend you read it just to get a sense of how odd their ideas was. Well, he was investigated for heresy by the church, his books banned and burned by the church, in large part because he imported non-Christian philosophical influences and tried to merge them with Christianity. So it's not the case that the rediscovery of ancient philosophical texts was welcomed by the church during the Renaissance because it aligned nicely with what were then Christian dogmas. Quite the opposite. Renaissance thinkers had to fight with the church hierarchy to incorporate these pre-Christian ideas into a reformed version of Christianity. So again, you see pre-Christian ideas influencing Christian thinking, including moral thinking. So I hope I've shown that pre-Christian philosophy, including the moral philosophy of the ancient Greeks, did have an influence on early Christian thinkers. I think I've shown that to believe this is only to be consistent with Glen's own argument, which relies on the belief that the prevailing moral culture of a time impinges itself on all those who live in that era. And I've shown that pre-Christian moral ideas continued to influence Christianity throughout its development, as when Renaissance thinkers rediscovered and reinterpreted ancient Greek and other writings, often in ways that conflicted with the church's teachings at the time. Pre-Christian thinking profoundly affected the development of Western civilization and therefore how we think today. On to point 2. I argue that there are anti-Christian sources of contemporary moral values. And in the debate, I give the example of Thomas Paine, one example who could stand in for the countless individuals who saw themselves not only as non-Christian, but opposed to Christian metaphysics and religion, who have had, I think, a profound influence on the moral culture of our time. Now, Glen, in his response to me, does not argue that Paine didn't have influence on our contemporary moral ideas. He doesn't say I was wrong to cite him as an influential thinker. Indeed, he calls him a massive influence on the Enlightenment. So why does he think that Christianity should still be credited with today's moral concepts? Well, Glen claims that Paine cannot escape Christian ideas and Christian concepts. So, according to Glen, whatever Paine's contributions were, they are ultimately down to Christianity. Listen to the first part of Glen's argument here.
In The Age of Reason, Thomas Paine did the classically hyper-Protestant move of looking back at medieval Christendom and seeing only darkness. It was an age of faith. We have now come through into an age of reason. Do you see this darkness to light story that he tells in The Age of Reason? He looks back at medieval Christendom and he calls it a vast sandy desert in which not a shrub appears to intercept the vision to the fertile hills beyond. He wants to escape from medieval Christendom and he thinks of that as the desert, but he is on his way to the promised land. Do you see how he cannot escape, actually, Christian ideas, Christian concepts, from darkness to light, from the wilderness wanderings and into the promised land? Thomas Paine was utterly shaped by Christian presuppositions, utterly shaped by Christian assumptions.
Now, what's the argument here, actually? If I was to put it in a more formal way, I'd say that it seems that Glen thinks that because Paine sometimes expresses his ideas in words and metaphors that are also used by Christian thinkers, that means his entire moral outlook is shaped by Christianity, and therefore his moral insights should be credited to Christianity. I think that on reflection, that argument is very poor. Why is it that using terminology that is used by other thinkers to express what are ultimately quite different, even opposing ideas, means that those different opposing ideas are attributable to the viewpoint that inspired the particular words that you're using? I just don't really see an argument there. Furthermore, the idea that imagery such as moving from darkness to light, where darkness represents chaos or lack of knowledge or evil, and light represents order and knowledge and goodness, is distinctively Christian, is bizarre. Human beings have used that metaphor for millennia, well before Christ and all over the world. The ancient Egyptians used the metaphor extensively. It's in evidence in Plato's allegory of the cave, in which light represents knowledge and the good. Most importantly, it's found in the Avesta, the sacred text of Zoroastrianism, which we know influenced Judaism and therefore Christianity. So I think that the idea that using similar metaphors to people in a different tradition means that your idea is attributed to that tradition is just weird and wrong. I don't see why we should credit that argument at all. But it's especially silly when the metaphors in question were widely used all over the world and in pre-Christian philosophies and religions. Glen goes on to say that even Paine's opposition to some of the ideas of Christians at his time were due to profoundly Christian reasons. Listen to what Glen says.
Even in the ways in which he opposed the Bible and the church, he was doing so for some profoundly Christian reasons. His most influential pamphlet was probably The Rights of Man, in which, as a deist, he believes in natural law and natural rights that all humans possess by virtue of God's existence and by virtue of the fact that we all possess a soul.
Now, I don't know about you, but I don't hear much profoundly Christian in what Glen has actually described there. Paine's view in Glen's description is certainly deistic, but deism isn't a orthodox Christian position. There's nothing distinctly Christian about someone being a deist. Many pre-Christian philosophers were deists, many post-Christian philosophers have been deists, but as far as I know, mainstream Christianity has never advocated deism, so I'm not sure why Glen seems to present this as evidence that Paine's views are inherently Christian here. Furthermore, Glen gives the example of Paine's belief in natural law as a fundamentally Christian idea, but the idea of a natural moral law was promoted by pre-Christian Greeks. In fact, it seems to be where some Christian philosophers and theologians got their idea from. So it's not distinctively Christian either. So where is the specifically Christian element here, which is supposed to demonstrate that someone like Thomas Paine owes his ideas to Christianity? I'm not seeing it, and deism and a belief in natural law are certainly not distinctively Christian ideas. I think what's happening here is that Glen is begging the question. He's assuming that his argument is correct, and then he's applying that to something that he's seeing and making what's essentially a circular argument. Because Glen's argument only works here if you assume beforehand that all these other ideas, like natural law, are distinctively Christian, but that's exactly what he's seeking to prove. So he's begging the question. He's assuming what he needs to prove. It becomes clearer later that there isn't really an argument behind Glen's position here when he quotes atheist thinker Yuval Noah Harari.
Don't take my word for it. Here's what Yuval Noah Harari, not a fan of Christianity, has to say. The Americans got the idea of equality from Christianity, which argues that every person has a divinely created soul and that all souls are equal before God. However, if we do not believe in the Christian myths about God, creation, and souls, what does it mean that all people are equal?
Now, I think Harari has some qualities as a popularizer of ideas, but he can be quite sloppy and overgeneral in his writing. And the important thing for us to ask here is what evidence does Noah Harari, and therefore by extension Glen, who's quoting him, offer that his position is correct? Well, I took a look at my copy of Noah Harari's book, and I saw in it that he gives no references to any scholarly sources, no supporting evidence, and no arguments to support that claim. It's just a bald assertion on Noah Harari's part, and Glen is assuming it to be true without offering any supporting evidence whatsoever. So it seems to me that Glen's argument that thinkers like Thomas Paine, who saw their philosophical project as opposed to central Christian doctrines, and who were seen that way by many Christians in their time, his argument that they are deeply indebted to Christianity is unsupported by anything he said. He doesn't point to specifically Christian ideas that Thomas Paine uses to ground his moral thinking, only asserting without argument that his deism and his belief in natural rights were due to Christianity, when we know that deism is not a Christian position and a belief in natural rights predates Christianity. All he's got then to support his argument is the fact that Thomas Paine used some similar metaphors and language to some other Christian thinkers, but that language was in wide currency all over the world before the birth of Christ, and it is a little odd to say that some person's ideas are indelibly stamped by other people's just because they use some similar terminology and metaphors. So I think that we can conclude from that at the very least, Glen hasn't supported his idea that my example of Thomas Paine as someone who is an anti-Christian thinker who's influenced today's moral thinking is deeply Christian. He's not. The third point I made in our debate is that there are non-Christian sources of contemporary moral values, and I gave the example of P.C. Chang, who was a Chinese philosopher who was extremely influential on the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and who used, I argue, Confucian philosophical concepts to ground his appreciation of universal human rights. Now, Glen wanted to argue something slightly different, that the drafting of a Universal Declaration of Human Rights was a pragmatic necessity and an inevitable outcome after the US's entry into the Second World War, and did not represent a sort of pluralistic approach to human dignity and rights. Listen to what Glen says in these two clips.
It is pragmatically very necessary to get the whole world on board with something that's going to hold us together. The Charter of the United Nations was signed in 1945 in San Francisco, the headquarters were put in New York City, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was going to happen no matter what.
Now, I don't know why Glen thinks this, and he doesn't actually tell us in the debate or in his response video the evidence he has to support those two assertions. My reading, based on reviewing the scholarship about the process of drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, including the excellent book, The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Origin, Drafting and Intent by Johannes Morsink, is that there was no guarantee at all that the effort to draft the Universal Declaration would be successful. Indeed, it almost completely fell apart a number of times. So I think that it represents a profound success of international diplomacy that we do have a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I don't think it was inevitable like Glen seems to think at all. Now, Glen goes on to argue that Chang was invited to play a role in the drafting of the Universal Declaration, but that his Confucianism had basically no influence on our contemporary understanding of human rights. Here is what he says.
They invited P.C. Chang, who was a wonderful Renaissance man. He was invited into this kind of setting. Did he have influence on the shaping of the UDHR? Sure. Was his Confucianism a source of contemporary Western values? Absolutely not. Which is a separate question from, could Confucianism come up with its own Declaration of Human Rights? Maybe it could, but that is not at all the burden of my thesis. My thesis is that Christianity is the air that we breathe, and the percentage of Confucianism within the Western atmosphere is so close to zero it makes no odds.
Did you hear what Glen said there? The influence of Confucianism on contemporary moral thinking is so close to zero as makes no odds. Why does Glen say this? What is the argument he uses to support his position? Well, I invite you to go and watch the debate for yourself and see if Glen offers any argument in support of that idea. Then watch the response video and see if there's an argument in there, because honestly, I can't see any argument. Now, my argument in the debate is very clear. The drafters of the Universal Declaration had long and well-documented debates about many of the different specific articles which later became the Universal Declaration. You can read about those debates themselves. If the Morsink book is too dense, you can try A World Made New by Mary Ann Glendon, which focuses on Eleanor Roosevelt's contribution. And in the records of the conversations that they actually had when they were writing what became the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it is clear that Chang's Confucianism was repeatedly advanced as his basis for human rights. Chang had a huge influence. And you don't have to believe me, just believe the published scholarship. In his book, P.C. Chang and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Hans Ingvar Ross, who is a professor of human rights at the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at Stockholm University, writes that Chang played a key role in determining the shape of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that he was one of the authors who bore perhaps the greatest responsibility for what we now consider the most significant characteristics of the Declaration, and finally that he tried to reconcile and support human rights thinking through references to Confucian thought. That's all on pages 1 to 3 of Roth's book. You can look them up yourself online. So who are you going to believe on this? You're going to believe Hans Ingvar Roth, a leading human rights scholar, a literal professor of human rights, and a former human rights officer for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, who said that Chang had some of the greatest responsibility for the most significant characteristics of the Universal Declaration and based his arguments on Confucianism? Or are you going to believe Glen and his completely unevidenced assertion that Confucianism had absolutely no role to play? Now, perhaps you might still try to argue that despite Chang's undeniable influence on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that doesn't mean that he influenced contemporary moral culture. So he may have played an important role in drafting the Universal Declaration, but he didn't play any role in shaping the air we breathe, the moral air we all breathe. But to believe that, you would have to believe that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has itself had no influence on the moral air we believe today. And I think that is flatly untenable. It is an absurd position. After all, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is almost 80 years old now and has had a profound influence on how we think about human dignity and rights all over the world. So, Confucianism influenced P.C. Chang. Chang, using Confucian arguments, influenced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Universal Declaration influences the moral air we breathe. Therefore, Confucianism influenced the moral air we breathe. Q-E-D. Now, I think these arguments are pretty clear. They're supported by tons of scholarship, including Christian scholars, who, as far as I can tell, agree that our contemporary moral synthesis, if we want to put it like that, is due to a lot of influences, including influences of pre-Christian thinkers, thinkers who saw themselves as opposed to Christianity like Thomas Paine, and thinkers who grew up in countries that were hardly exposed to Christianity like P.C. Chang. And that is why I believe that the moral air we breathe is not distinctively Christian. It is a human accomplishment, an accomplishment of people all over the world engaged in a cultural conversation that has been ongoing for millennia. If we want to credit anyone with the creation of the moral air we breathe, we should credit ourselves, humanity.